Welcome, everyone, to the podcast of the Woodising School for Composers. My guest today is Christopher Still. Chris has been playing with the Los Angeles Philharmonic since 2007. Before then, he was the principal trumpet player of the Colorado Symphony. He's also played with orchestras in Chicago, Boston, St. Louis, among other places. Chris is a passionate educator with specialties, of course, in trumpet, but also audition prep, as well as online business. In his spare time, Chris loves distance running and beer brewing. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here, and congrats on getting this podcast off the ground. I think it's going to be awesome.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really excited for it. So let's get started. Tell me about your path to joining the Los Angeles Philharmonic.
Sure. So it's pretty typical path that you go to music school and you start taking auditions, and hopefully you work your way up the ladder. I started in a smaller regional orchestra. I was principal trumpeter of the Charleston Symphony, and that came after decades of freelancing in Boston and other places. So you kind of start there and then quickly realize, I think I need to keep working to get to a bigger orchestra and a better orchestra and a better paying orchestra, an orchestra that brings in better soloists and better conductors and better guest composers, for example. And
Mhm.
so that path led to a 1 year as associate principal in Dallas, which turned into 3 years. And then I won principal in Colorado, did some summers in Grant Park, and then, as you mentioned, freelanced in other orchestras in Boston and St. Louis and places. And then won my job here in LA in 2007, started at the Hollywood Bowl, and been here ever since. And I'm done. This is my destination orchestra, and I don't think there will be any other auditions in my future other than helping other people with theirs.
That's awesome. Well, I mean, the LA Philharmonic, the name speaks for itself, but what do you love about the LA Phil? Why is this your destination orchestra?
Well, I didn't know how much I was going to love Los Angeles until we actually moved out here. And it turns out that this city is, the community is so behind people taking chances with art. There's
Hmm.
the film industry, obviously, but just in terms of visual arts and museums and opera and ballet and theater, it's just, there's so many people taking a lot of chances here. And the LA Phil, especially with Frank Gehry's amazing Walt Disney Concert Hall architecture, and Esa-Pekka Salonen, who hired me, his whole vision and mission was to make new music less of a weird thing. And our audience supports it. In fact, we have a new music program, a series called The Green Umbrella, which
Mhm.
was named green as in like fertile soil, things growing, and umbrella covering all different types of music. So it's not like just orchestral, it's electronic, there's soloists, it's crazy. Sometimes those concerts in LA have more people in the audience than I had for a Mahler symphony in Colorado. And
Wow.
so that speaks to just sort of what this city embraces in terms of what they're willing to support. And I personally love the new music that we do here because we can get into this later, but it is a challenge and keeps me sharp as a player. So that's one of the reasons. It's also the highest paid orchestra in the country,
I'm
not
sure
including
that doesn't
the
hurt.
Met. That helps.
Yeah.
LA is not a cheap town to live in,
Mhm.
but I just love it. You can have mountains, you can have the beach, you can have urban. It's there are horses. People walk horses down the street where I live, so kind of have a little bit of everything.
That sounds awesome. Well, I mean, I'm like 15 years too late, but congratulations, and I'm happy for you that this is where it
Thank
is
you.
that you've ended up.
Thank you very much.
And I'm glad that you mentioned that about the new music. What's it like playing that much new music?
What's it like playing that much new music? It's a mixed blessing in
Mhm.
that, if we played in an orchestra that was more of a standard repertoire based orchestra, you know, overture, concerto, symphony, I think my job would be a lot less work in terms of the preparation because at this point I've played most of the standard repertoire multiple times
Mhm.
with different orchestras. So I don't really need to work too hard to prepare a Beethoven 9 or a Brahms 4 or a Strauss tone poem. We've played them so many times. Um, but on the other hand, part of the reason why I think I can sit down and play a Strauss tone poem without breaking a sweat is that the new music that we constantly do here, has elevated my level of what I think is reasonable for my instrument and what I am capable of as a musician. And so it has built in uh, to my playing and my routines and how I prepare for my job a higher level than I think I would expect from myself if I hadn't had those challenges. So that's a benefit. Some people may not look at it as a benefit because I do have to earn my paycheck every week, but I really love it and it keeps me mentally sharp as well. That I never know what's coming. This week we're recording a 3 hour opera of John Adams,
Hmm.
Girls of the Golden West, and that's just like a normal week at the LA Phil that will have a happening like that. So I can't remember how many new pieces we premiered this year, but we usually do close to 50 new works a season, which is basically a new piece every single week.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's a really exciting thing for me as a player.
Well, it's an exciting thing for me to hear as composers, and I'm sure like a lot of the listeners would be excited about this as well, just because, in other cities and other orchestras, it feels like, orchestra music is sort of like a dead art form. Occasionally they throw us composers a bone and they're like, oh, okay, we will maybe give you something new to listen to. But, so often it's all the old stuff. So to hear the kind of stuff that you and the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra is up to, it's actually really heartening and exciting. I think that's really cool.
I mean, I think it's important to play the masterworks that basically paved the road to where we are today. And it's important to keep people fluent in Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, all that. Like that is part of our DNA.
Mhm.
But to get to juxtapose it with Andrew Norman or Thomas Addis or these other composers who are just writing such great music that will become the classic standard repertoire in the future. John Adams, Esa-Pekka Salonen, these composers are creating things that are seminal, and that is amazing that we get to like actually live through the revisions of these pieces with the composer standing there, or sometimes run back and sit next to us on the stage and ask, hey, what about this? Is this working for you? Is this coming across the way I want it to? That is what a gift that is. Can you imagine if you had that opportunity with Mahler or Beethoven? I mean, I can't imagine what that would be like.
Yeah, no, that would have been incredible. Well, since you've raised the subject, have there been any composers that you've worked with that you've just really loved working with them at the orchestra?
Yeah, I mean, I sound like a broken record, but the four names I just rattled off: John Adams, Esa-Pekka Salonen, Thomas Addis, and Andrew Norman are uh, some of the ones that I really enjoy, and they're all white males. I realize, and there's plenty of female composers that we work with, African American composers. Jessie Montgomery, we play a lot of her music here, so I love working with all of these people, and they're all completely different. Um, you have three of those people I just mentioned on the podium conducting their music often. So that's a really cool interaction that we get. I mean, Esa-Pekka is so cerebral in his writing and his delivery, and Thomas Addis is so he's so soft spoken, but also so brash in his writing. It's like his music thrashes the orchestra sometimes. It's amazing. Um, it's really cool to get to walk up to these guys and talk to them and and just say thank you sometimes. Like, my God, thank you for writing Inferno, Thomas Addis. This is like a gift to the orchestra world, which we recorded a couple years ago. Or was it this year? I don't know. It's all a blur with COVID. um, and watching someone like Andrew Norman, who's a little bit more on the younger spectrum of the composers I just mentioned, have these meteoric rises. Like, I remember some of his first work we did, and now it's just like this relationship that we have where I understand the vocabulary of these composers, and so when we play their music, I kind of already know kind of what they're looking for, and that's a really cool relationship to build too.
Yeah, I can see how that would be. I can see how that'd be very beneficial. Um, and one thing I think is interesting as well about, so you're talking about interacting with all these fantastic concert composers, is that, you're there in Los Angeles, Hollywood is right there. How often do you and your colleagues also record for film studios?
That's a great question, and it's such a totally different experience.
Mhm.
Um, Pretty often, not everybody in the orchestra is interested in that work, and the bigger problem is we're just not available for it most of the time. I cringe to think about how many sessions I've had to say no to, like these really high grossing films like the Lego movies.
Mhm.
where if you play on these soundtracks, you're getting secondary payments as they get repurposed for other uses. So these films pay for years and years, and it's just also really fun to tell your kids, hey, I played on Super Pets. That's me right there. Um, so this it's a really fun thing to do. It's a totally different skill set
Yeah.
and a different vibe. And the composers that we work with there are have just a different way of writing. Um, yeah, it's hard to compare studio work with symphonic work because you never really play a whole phrase all the way through in the studios, and you don't play it for another person. You're playing for the guys in the booth.
Yeah.
So it's just like a different lens of the microscope. It just changes everything.
Well, maybe let's dig into that a little bit. And I want to like zero in on something you just said. So when you don't have the audience energy to feed off of when you're in the studio, how do you find that? How do you dig that out of yourself?
That's a great question, and I say I don't know if I have the answer because it's it's really about playing with the click. It's about instantly adjusting to the players around you. For example, during the pandemic, LA Phil shut down like every other orchestra, which is nothing happening, and the studios all shut down too. But after a while, the studios were able to get back online, and thanks to the technology that we have sitting around, musicians were able to record their tracks from home, and
Hmm.
do live sessions with oh, what's the software? Uh, uh, I'm blanking out on the software they all use. It's like
I don't remember either.
what's that?
I don't remember either.
Yeah, it's the standard thing. They would have somebody pop up on Zoom and be a sound engineer, just like in the studio, except for instead of a booth, they were on your second monitor, and you were playing these tracks into the click. And I thought, oh my God, why would we ever go back to playing in person when you can just do it on your own from home? And the answer, which I thought was super interesting, was the mixing guys and the editors said it was so much more work this way because nobody was reacting to what was happening around them. All the
Hmm.
articulations were specifically individual, the breaths, the length, the lines, everything was like cut off from the normal communication that we have as musicians. And so then they had to do all this fancy editing to make everything match. And I thought that is the difference between live music and sitting in a studio is there's an organic communication that happens amongst the orchestra that makes the product cohesive and hopefully what's on the page that the composer wanted. And that wasn't happening when people were recording at home because how could you match anybody else when there was nobody else there? So I thought that was a really interesting window into the differences between studio work and symphonic work. And make no mistake about it, there are inherent challenges to both of these jobs. And I think the guys who can just play this stuff cold, perfect, sight read when that red light bulb comes on is amazing. And the guys in the studio who do it, I have huge amount of respect for them. But our job is different. And to get back to your question finally, is the energy that the audience brings is part of what drives that emotional connection, which is the whole point of music anyway, right?
Hmm.
So I find it a lot easier to sit down and play live without a safety net than to sit down and try and recreate that energy with the red light bulb.
Hmm. I think that's interesting. This idea of playing without a safety net of, as and what it's making me think of is that as artists, we do our best work when we're taking risks.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, what's the worst that could happen, right? Somebody chips a note or misses an entrance or whatever. There's no real risk, but uh, we want to honor the music that's in front of us, and we certainly have a deep level of commitment to our colleagues. We want to show up prepared and do a good job, and we want to support each other and also, throw down and get it done. So there's a slight element of risk. Um, I think the most interesting things happen when we step outside the comfort zone, not too far outside. And we can talk about that in terms of composition if you like. But I think that energy is what makes hearing a Mahler symphony for the 30th time interesting. That's why we keep coming back to this music is because it's different every time based on who's in the room, how are you feeling that day. So I love steeping in that energy.
Yeah, no, I think that that's really cool. Maybe let's do pursue that composition thing. I mean, you're a trumpet player, and I have some trumpet specific questions that I'd love to ask you about, and so like this idea of, taking risks as a composer. What's one thing that you wish composers knew when they're writing for trumpet?
Hmm. Don't write so many high notes. No, well, I guess here it would be. I can't speak for all musicians,
Mhm,
but I will speak for myself and people who feel the way I do about new music. In that, I want you to understand that we're sharing a similar goal, and that similar goal is we want your music to sound great, and we want your music to be performed. And we would love it if your music sounds great, is performed, and has a impactful connection to the people who are listening to it. That's a win for everybody. That's a win for the composer. It's a win for the organization. It's a win for the musicians. More importantly, it's a win for the audience who will keep coming back because we're a business at the end of the day.
mhm,
um, to that point, the way to get your music to sound great and the way to get your music to be performed and the way to get your music to sound great, performed, and connect is to know what you're doing. And I want you to push me. I want you to push the envelope. I want you to make me sit down and puzzle through, huh, how am I going to make that work? However, if you're going to ask me to do that, you had better have done your homework and know what the reasonable expectations are to start with. In other words, push me, but know what you're doing. In other words, don't write off the range of my instrument, for example. Like
mhm.
that's basic. I saw a piece for marimba, went right off the lowest note possible on any marimba. And I asked percussionists, well, what are you supposed to do? He's like, nothing. There is no marimba that plays that note. That's just like a rookie mistake that when a musician sees that kind of writing, we instantly kind of dismiss it as, well, this person doesn't know what they're doing. They didn't put in the effort to understand. And I'm not talking about idiosyncratic writing because
Mhm,
I've had pieces that had, Gunther Schuller's style 16th note runs through the orchestra where the trumpets were playing what sounded like clarinet parts.
mhm.
It totally makes sense with Gunther Schuller. Like he knew what he was doing when he wrote that. If I have a trumpet line that sounds like a clarinet part and I have to work on it for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then you can't even hear it, or it doesn't make sense. I can tell that your keyboard wrote that and it just kind of got dumped into the trumpet parts. Uh, that is frustrating for us because we feel like we're not being used in a way that makes sense. Especially when you look over and the clarinets are just sitting there. I'm like, why on earth are we playing this when
Mhm.
clearly this is a clarinet sort of a line? And I know I might sound a little arrogant suggesting that I know better, but as long as it makes sense within certain parameters, push us around, but make sure you know what you're doing when you ask us to do that.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Well, which I'll ask the converse question is, what are the kinds of things that you love to play? I mean, high notes, maybe not all the time, but
Yeah.
what sort of things do you love to play?
Ugh. I I love Brahms. I
Yeah.
love John Williams. I love all the composers I just mentioned. Um, I mean, I like bravura trumpet. I think there's a certain beautiful, like if you listen to John Adams' City Noir,
Mhm,
there's this gorgeous lyrical, not bravura, but lyrical trumpet solo called in the movement called City Lights. And it's sort of Chinatown-esque. Oh my God, that is a gift to the trumpet section. When we get to play something like that, it's like, this is epic music.
mhm,
Or, you get a John Williams, Raiders of the Lost Ark. That is a fun thing to play. It is completely idiosyncratic for the instrument. It is perfect for the trumpets. If the clarinet section, sorry, I'm picking on the clarinet so much, but if they were playing bum, ba dum, that would not have the same impact. And again, if the trumpets were playing, you know, Daphnis, that would be so ridiculous. Like I don't know. I don't. We're not the bubbling, babbling brook or whatever that's supposed to be. So, um, I love playing loud stuff. I mean, I guess I'm a bit of a trumpet head that way, but I think it's also interesting when composers flip that idiosyncratic writing on its head and search for what is the opposite of what that instrument normally does. Can you write for that too? Again, within parameters that make sense for us. I love when composers do that.
Yeah.
This is maybe something interesting for composers to know is the role of the different parts of the section. What kind of writing does the principal player get versus the section players? And sometimes it's equal. You'll have Mahler 7, all three of us are playing bum ba da 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 dee ba da 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 dee ba da 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 dee, and it's just like principal trumpet time. That is like throwing down high C's. And other times my job is just so supportive, and I'm just weaving underneath and knowing when we go to unison, and it's so nuanced. And the musician will take care of all that. The composer doesn't have to worry about that. But knowing what our roles are maybe is an interesting thing to know about as you're writing. Thinking of John Adams, his second trumpet parts are either right up there alongside the principal, or we're down in the basement playing like, you know, like the lowest notes on the trumpet, these percussive things. So it's so fun to see how different composers play with our skill sets.
Yeah. So when you play for the LA Phil, do you generally play like the second or third trumpet part, or how does that work?
I am the second trumpet in the LA Phil.
You
So I
are
will.
the second trumpet.
What's that?
You are the second trumpet, always and forever.
That's my job. That's my role.
Mhm,
Um, I hardly ever play third or fourth because there's four trumpets in the orchestra.
mhm,
Um, and I will occasionally play principal if there's a like someone's on vacation and they need someone to cover. But I don't love playing principal. It's not something
hmm,
I'm jonesing to do. In fact, I prefer to play section. I prefer to take what my principal is doing and synergize and see what I can create, how I can support, what's a new color I can create by adding myself to what he's doing. That is what I think I'm the best at. Anyway, I'm a great wingman. So that's people outside of music say, "Oh, you're second trumpet. So how long before you move up to first?" I'm
mhm.
like, "That's not how it works. I have no interest in playing first, and I will retire as second trumpet."
Let's maybe geek out just for a little bit. I mean, I know that a lot of performers just love their gear. So something with all of the brass instruments is they've just gone through so many evolutions over the years, and there are different there are different pieces were written for different trumpets and different transpositions. And so one thing I'm curious about is how many different trumpets do you own and when do you use them? Do you ever have to transpose a part that was written in one key because you're like, no, I think it'd sound better on this instrument?
That's a good question. So the standard, so a professional musician in an orchestra in this country is going to have a C trumpet, like the one sitting up here,
Mhm,
and a B flat trumpet. Those are the basic tools.
mhm,
Um, we rarely use B flat trumpet in the orchestra. Um, the only reason I would ever use it is if it's like a Duke Ellington chart where it just fits nicely, or if it's something that goes really low, like Carmen Prelude goes to B flat, so we have to play these super low notes.
mhm,
For the most part, the only instrument you need to worry about is the C trumpet, and your parts generally should just be written for C trumpet.
mhm,
Um, we can transpose into any key, but it's standard to start with C trumpet. Um, so B flat C. We play piccolo, which is in B flat or A. There's also an F G piccolo, but you rarely see that in orchestral writing. It's more of a chamber music brass quintet sort of a thing.
mhm,
um, we play rotary trumpets frequently. So B flat and C rotary trumpets from Germany. Um, we have an E flat D that's more of a concerto trumpet, but for new music, I've used a D or an E flat occasionally. We have flugelhorn, which is a much bigger bell. It's a Chuck Mangione sort of a trumpet,
mhm,
more of a mellow sound. Very cool in new music because it just creates this interesting linkage between the trombones and the horns.
mhm.
And then, of course, we have cornets, which we use, which is more of a trumpet is 2/3 cylindrical, 1/3 conical, and a cornet is 1/3 cylindrical, 2/3 conical. So that gives an indication of what that might sound like. Um,
Well, for those who don't know the difference, what would that sound like?
Cylindrical instruments like a trumpet would to be stereotypically are more strident, more piercing, and a conical instrument like a French horn is more of a warm, mellow sound. So your cornet is going to sound more warm. Think Berlioz, March to the Scaffold, that kind of bum bum bumpy yum ba-dum ba-dum. That's a cornet. Whereas like think William Tell trumpets, deem tigadum tigadum, that's more of a strident sound. So that's the difference there. Um, but if I had to say you only get one trumpet to do your job for the rest of your career with, it's going to be a C trumpet right there.
Okay. Okay. And then um, again, that's awesome. And it's cool to hear all of the different instruments that you're using. And do you personally own all of these instruments? Or
Yeah, and the good news is trumpets are cheap. I mean, uh, my trumpets are really inexpensive. I think trumpets and trombones are probably the least expensive instruments in the orchestra, but we do have to own, you know, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 trumpets that you cycle through. And then we have usually multiples of each instrument. I have, 2 or 3 C trumpets, and um, you just you kind of collect them over time.
yeah.
I didn't answer your question about transposition though, which is occasionally, and this happens in new music, there's just something that's just really touchy, really high, or really soft. I might break out a piccolo and then transpose that at sight to make it easier for me. I don't expect the composer to anticipate that. In fact, I don't really want the composer to anticipate that and write it out, because then if I decide not to play it on pick, then I have to reverse transpose it, which is annoying. Um,
Mhm.
However, some of the new music I've gotten, the parts are so freaky, and sometimes the composer will like talk to a trumpet player and say, "What instrument would you use?" And that trumpet player may say, "Oh, this would lay great on an E flat." When you guys add a an alternative part to the library, that is a gift. Like
Mm.
if you throw an E flat part in there, or a D part, or a pick part that's already transposed, I'm happy. I know I sound like maybe I'm being mentally lazy, but it's a lovely thing. Again, remember my shared goal. I want your music to sound great, and I want it to be reasonable for me. That's awfully helpful when it comes up.
Well, I mean, these days, I mean, particularly in Dorico, it's so easy to create an alternate part where it's just like, here's that same part, but for a different transposition. I mean, it's just a few clicks of a button and you're good to go.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah.
I
Um,
asked my trumpet teacher in high school, I said, why don't they just write out all the transpositions, just make it all C trumpet so we don't have to transpose? And he said, well, Chris, then everyone would be a good trumpet player. So that was a pretty fair argument, that the mental acrobatics you have to go through are part of the rigor of becoming a good musician.
no, I totally believe that. I mean, because you think about it as well is that, if you're transposing this in your head, I don't know what your mental process is like for transposition. I think that'd be an interesting question to ask, but there's certainly at least some element of audiation, right? Where you're imagining the sound in your head before it's coming out on your instrument, right?
There is, and the technique that I use is clef transpositions. If it's an E flat part, I'll just slap a bass clef and add 3 flats. If it's an E part, bass clef, 4 sharps. There's all the different clefs you can use: alto clef, French violin clef, just moving them around based on. I mean, if you're looking at a second line G,
Hmm.
and it's a Mahler part and it's trumpet and F, that's a C. So you're either thinking up a fourth, or you're just removing the clef, adding a C clef on the second line, and adding 1 flat to the key signature, and it's the same thing. So because music is horizontal, I prefer changing the clef and reading it this way than to read every note up an interval or down an interval. Except for Shostakovich, when his third trumpet parts are in F alta, which is up a fourth, down an octave. That's a
Hmm.
really irritating transposition, because your brain is kind of going in 2 directions at the same time. Um,
So when you get a part like that, that's just the part that you're stuck with, and you need to figure out how to transpose it by sight.
yeah, and there's always that moment where you see that third trumpet part for the first time, and you're like, what the heck is F alta? And your teacher says, oh, that's just up a fourth, down an octave.
You're
Like,
like, oh, okay.
oh, that is that all? Yeah, so it is just part of the challenge of playing a transposing instrument. So
Yeah. Well, I want to ask, while I have you here and your expertise, I want to ask one more question that might be interesting to composers, and that's about mutes. Because I've heard and I've seen all different sorts of stories of, how much time does it take to change mutes? Like, should you give it a lot of time? Can you actually do it really fast? So I was wondering if you could maybe explain for us, like, how fast how much time would you want if you're playing a new piece of music to change mutes?
That's a great question. Reminding me of a quintet piece we premiered at one point when I was in Boston that had an instantaneous mute change, like sustained pitch that went from straight mute to cup mute. I was like, how many bells do you think my trumpet has? Like, I don't, this is not possible. All right, well, I can tell you right here.
Yeah.
Okay. Hold on. So if you want me to go, plug my headphones back in. If you want me to go from harmon mute to straight mute,
Mm-hmm.
and here's my harmon mute. And sometimes I have to do this to get some breath in there so the cork has something to stick to. And I'm playing, so 1, 2, I'm playing, I'm doing your wah wah that you wrote. And now you
Sure.
want me to go to straight mute. It takes about this long. There you go. So however many seconds that was is about as fast as I can change mutes. If you're asking me to do it faster than that, it gets ridiculous and we have to start doing crazy things. For example, our good friend Gustav Mahler in
Mhm.
his first symphony, last movement, bum is muted and then open. Ba bum bum be muted. Da 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 open. Ba dum bum bum ba ba be muted. Da da da. Like what what was he thinking? It's impossible. It is so difficult to play one-handed and keep coming in and out. So I actually devised something when I was in Dallas called Clippy,
Oh, interesting. I'm so intrigued.
which
What,
is
what's going on here?
what's going on here is this is a piece of electrical cable and a clip, a really strong clip, and a straight mute, which I drilled a hole in the bottom of.
Mm-hmm.
And then I put some felt on the corks. And I basically just clip this to my music stand and I just lean into the mute back and forth when I have to play Mahler. I call it Clippy. I will tell you, composers, right now, don't expect people to go out to Home Depot in order to play your piece because it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know too many trumpet players that have gone through the effort of making Clippy, but it's just necessary. Overture to Candide has and then you have dum to take the mute out and play bum 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 ba ba beep ba ba. And it's you're playing at the Hollywood Bowl and it's 95 degrees and your hands are sweating. It's really hard. I put Clippy on the stand, and I've definitely used Clippy in some new music as well. So there are workarounds, but give us a little time to switch mutes, I guess is the takeaway. And also know what our mutes do, especially with this one. This one just confuses people when
Yeah.
they're like harmon mute, stem in. This is the stem. So is this stem in to you, or is this stem out, or is this stem out? Like the vocabulary for how to use these mutes is not really defined. So we want to make sure we understand what you want us to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, we could have a whole other conversation about that sort of thing, which actually leads to the next question I wanted to ask. So you're going to be one of the guests for the Wizarding School of Composers Spring Session. You and some colleagues from the orchestra are going to be coming in and essentially having this kind of conversation and going into more depth about what you like to play, what you don't like to play, the things that you've seen that are positive, and the things, that composers want to avoid. Can you tell me a little bit more about can you tell me a little bit more about your colleagues that will be joining you for this event?
Yeah, let's see. So we have Evan, our contrabassoonist, who is one of the best contrabassoonists and actually bassoonists I've ever heard. Phenomenal human being, also a composer, and so he's going to be a great resource in just understanding, what is it that we're trying to communicate? How do we understand your notation? That kind of thing. Gloria is a cellist who's going to be joining us. She is also an audition coach like I am. Phenomenal cellist, been on audition panels. She understands the ins and outs of how string instruments work. It's going to be a great resource. Joe, our principal timpanist, who is, again, one of the best timpanists I've ever heard, also a composer and teacher. I think he's going to be a great resource. I imagine as a composer, percussion is sort of a dark and confusing place, especially if you're not a percussionist. There's so many instruments and techniques that I think he'll be a great resource, and then myself bringing up the brass part. So I think we've got all the sections covered, and I bet I'm curious for the conversation, but I bet you're going to find that while there are differences in all of our instruments and how they behave, I bet our concerns are going to be similar in many ways as far as what we like to see and what we wish we saw less of in new music.
Yeah, no, I suspect that that's the case. Um, so why, I'm excited that you're coming and excited that, Evan and Joe and Gloria are coming because they all, I know Gloria personally, but I haven't met Evan or Joe yet, but they sound awesome from what you've shared. Why are you excited to come talk to the composers?
Well, I mean, first of all, because you asked, it's
Oh,
like
shit.
it's a nice invitation to get a chance to have a dialogue with the people who are writing the music that we have to play at work.
Hmm.
Um, Sometimes we have to play this stuff into a camera and record it. Sometimes we're live streaming this thing to movie theaters. Sometimes we're radio streaming. It's pressure, and we want to do a good job. It's back to that shared goal
Hmm.
that I have personally, and I know many of my colleagues do. We want we want to sound good, and we want your music to sound good. And so if we can have a dialogue about um, helping you meet us in the middle as far as making our jobs as easy as possible and pushing our boundaries in a reasonable way, like I mentioned before. um, and I have questions for composers too, like, why would you write that technique? What are you looking for? Like, I want to know what it is. I love it when there's a YouTube video of an interview of a composer saying, well, the reason I wrote this piece was I was thinking about this, and these are the effects I'm going for. And getting a chance to actually have that dialogue is something we don't get to do with Strauss and Mozart and Haydn. We just can't. So it's a beautiful opportunity to open a dialogue, and hopefully for the betterment of our whole industry. Um, we haven't really talked about it, but I think there's a lot of avenues in orchestral music that have yet to even be set foot on, as far as the types of music and the types of projects and collaborations that we could be doing. And I think what better place to start than having a conversation about it?
Yeah, well, you have me intrigued. So we're going to have, of course, this conversation in the full Wizarding School program, but can you maybe give us a little bit of a teaser? What are some of your thoughts about some of these projects and collaborations that you think that don't exist right now?
Well, I I don't know because I haven't dreamt them up because I'm not a composer, but I would say it's more of the opposite of what's here already. Picture your typical orchestra performance
Mhm.
where people are wearing tails and everyone files in into tiny little seats, and um, they all sit quietly and they read their program notes, and the conductor comes out and they experience a piece of music in silence, and they sit quiet and they clap at the end. um, that's pretty boring. you know that's
Yeah.
like that's like basic. We've been doing that for a long time. I
Hmm.
think it's time to change up the entire experience and make it more immersive, make it more hands-on. Think about the best museums you've ever gone to.
Hmm.
What stands out to you when you get to touch stuff and play with it and bang it around or throw it or spin a dial or something? Like, when you get to be inside of it, it connects with you more. And we're not doing a good job with as orchestras right now. It's very staid and stoic, and I'd love to see more. I'm not suggesting theatrics, but just let's like loosen up a little bit, and let's try something crazy. This is why I love Andrew Norman's music. If you
Hmm.
listen to Play, it literally
Oh,
sounds
fun,
like an
please.
orchestra in a pinball machine, and audiences love it. We love it. I want more stuff like that makes me have like a rollicking good time, or just like dive deep into. There's a Dalla Piccolo piece for a woodwind quintet. They just pass in concert A around the whole time.
Mhm.
It's amazing. It's mind blowing. Like, more of that kind of stuff. Challenge me as a listener. That's I don't know what that looks like. That's your guys' job to figure out.
Well, I look forward to joining you and your colleagues, and then I'll bring the composers, and we'll have a great conversation about this and figuring out, what this could possibly look like.
Cool.
So as we wrap up here, I just want to say, Chris, thanks so much for coming. But before I let you go, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with people?
Well, I think we covered everything, Joseph. Um, I would just say anytime anybody creates something, there's a high level of fear involved because you're becoming vulnerable and taking a big chance. And I
Mm,
would just say, I can only speak for myself. You have a cheerleader here in the orchestra who we want your music to be great, and we want to have a great relationship while we experience it together. And if it's scary, good. That means you're doing something new. And I would just lean into that and know that the orchestra is supporting you 100%. As long as we all behave and help and be respectful towards each other, it
mm.
can be a lot of fun premiering a new piece.
That's awesome. I love those words. I love that that generosity. Well, Chris, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining me, and yeah, we'll see you in a few months in the Wizarding School for Composers.
Look
Take
forward
care.
to it. Thanks for having me, Joseph. See ya.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.